I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as we get more clarity on what the Europeans proposed to Donald Trump in that historic White House summit yesterday, we hear the latest from the battlefront as Russian progress appears to have been stymied, and then do a deep dive into Moscow's reaction to this week's diplomatic developments. What exactly are they signalling?
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 19th of August, 3 years and 178 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and the Telegraph's former Russia correspondent, James Kilner. But first, the major diplomatic developments after those significant meetings yesterday. It's been a big 24 hours, and so once again, I'm just going to begin with the major diplomatic developments after the summit yesterday. I should just say at the top of the episode that if you missed our bonus pod that we put out last night, I highly recommend that you check that out because we go into much more detail into the subjects of the summit that took place between European leaders and, of course, that encounter, much improved encounter between Zelensky and Trump. But let me just dive in to bring you up to date, first of all, on what's happened since then. President Zelensky and Putin are likely to sit down for a bilateral meeting within 2 weeks, confirmed German Chancellor Friedrich Merz earlier. The Russian president agreed to that summit during a phone call with Donald Trump. He told reporters after that extraordinary meeting at the White House yesterday, which saw Ukraine's allies gather to show support for Zelensky and allay fears of a decision being made about how to try and end this war without the Europeans being at the table. Merz and France's Emmanuel Macron said a ceasefire must be put in place before consideration of a final peace deal. But Putin and Trump have both now rejected such demands in favour of an immediate agreement. Indeed, there remain large gaps between the two sides that did not appear to be bridged yesterday, with little mention made of Ukraine giving up large swathes of its own territory, a key condition for the Kremlin and something that Washington would appear to be at least open to. We recorded a special bonus episode after the summit last night, so if you want a full breakdown of what took place and its implications, do listen to that. After the meetings, we got lots of reactions from the leaders in attendance. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said he was very pleased with the outcome of the meeting, which demonstrated a real sense of unity among the leaders, he said. He also emphasised that no decision should be made about Ukraine without Ukraine. Tellingly, the head of the UK Armed Forces is travelling to the US today for detailed talks about American involvement in security guarantees. We understand Starmer's tasked Chief of the Defence Staff, Sir Tony Radakin, someone we've interviewed on the podcast before, with fleshing out details of measures to protect Ukraine in the event of a peace deal. Now, Friedrich Merz, in a significant step, has also opened the door to his troops taking part in peacekeeping missions in Ukraine. That does mark a shift. He said the issue needed to be discussed with his coalition and that it was too early to give a definitive answer, contradicting an earlier statement by Germany's foreign minister who suggested that the German army did not have the capacity to take part in such a mission. Just as a reminder, German troop deployments overseas need a mandate from the German parliament, and there's only been one permanent deployment in the country's post-war history, the posting of about 5,000 troops, I think, in Lithuania earlier this year to police the NATO border with Russia. Now, French President Emmanuel Macron also echoed Merz's comments for a ceasefire, but said that the European military forces should help Ukraine with boots on the ground definitively. He is in favour of the bilateral summit taking place in Geneva, Switzerland, so neutral territory. Interestingly, in the last hour, Switzerland has said that it would grant Putin immunity from prosecution if he visited the country for Russia-Ukraine peace talks. That might suggest that things are quite far along in terms of trying to agree that that would be the venue. But again, we just don't know definitively. Finnish President Alexander Stubb, also in the meeting yesterday, struck a more cautious tone afterwards, saying there was nothing concrete about US participation in security guarantees for Ukraine. As for the bilateral meeting between Zelensky and Putin, he said the Russian leader cannot be trusted. Quite remarkably, it's been reported that during the closed-door meeting, Stubb called the eastern Ukrainian cities of Kramatorsk and Slovyansk a bastion against the Huns, a description that appeared to impress Trump, according to officials in the room. Now, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, after the summit, said one of the most important questions was how to be sure that it won't happen again, which is the precondition of every kind of peace. Her foreign minister has just backed French calls for Geneva to host those peace talks, though, as I say, there's no guarantee that that will actually happen. And Reuters are reporting again in the last hour that the talks could be held in Hungary, citing a US administration source. Of course, there'll be some major concerns if that proved to be the case. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen reiterated calls for the return of Ukrainian children abducted by Russia, saying the human cost of the war must end, something she did in the opening remarks to the meeting yesterday. Now, quite remarkably, later, Trump posted this on social media. Ursula von der Leyen, the distinguished and highly respected President of the European Commission, and I have discussed the massive worldwide problem of missing children. This is likewise a big subject with my wife Melania. It is a subject at the top of all lists, and the world will work together to solve it, hopefully bringing them home to their families. So at last, it seems that the issue of stolen children is on the major political agenda being discussed by world leaders. That is a significant step from where we have been for years now. And I thought it was interesting, as we talked about, that President Zelensky gave that letter to Trump for his wife, speaking about the issue of children. Clearly, this is something that it has been decided needs to be talked about. Whether that is for strategic reasons, we don't know. But nonetheless, it does mark a shift, and we should discuss it more, I think. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte said Trump was a pragmatic peacemaker and that leaders would be working on security guarantees over the next few days. Perhaps the most significant details to emerge after the meetings, however, are more details of what exactly the Europeans put on the table. According to the Financial Times, Ukraine promised to buy $100 billion worth of American weapons financed by Europe in order to give US security guarantees in the event of a peace deal. Washington and Kyiv would also sign a $50 billion deal to produce drones with Ukrainian companies. Now, during his Oval Office meeting with Zelensky on Monday, Trump did suggest, as we discussed, that there would be some US military support for Ukraine when the war ends. To quote him again, he promised very good protection, very good security, although the extent of US assistance is still very unclear. When we hear those words, security guarantees, I think we immediately imagine an Article 5 style pledge, something several European leaders urged publicly yesterday. But what form beyond that could these potentially take? And I think there are broadly four possibilities, as summarised by the BBC's Frank Gardner. The first is boots on the ground, considered the least likely. As Frank writes, Trump views this war as Europe's problem. For him to commit ground troops, even in a peacekeeping role, to a conflict he deeply dislikes would take a major about-face. Second, air and sea patrols. That is more conceivable. The US has already operated surveillance flights to monitor the course of the war. But again, there is a world of difference between a non-confrontational reconnaissance flight or maritime patrol and an armed clash with a nuclear power like Russia. I agree. Intelligence next, says Frank. US satellite and aerial intelligence has proven vital in helping Ukraine hold back the advance of Russia's invading forces. In the event of a peace deal agreed by all, this is one area where the US probably would be happy to assist. Yep, but is it enough, of course? And then lastly, logistics. Whatever form the UK French-led reassurance force eventually takes, then it's going to need a lot of logistical support. This is one non-lethal area that Washington would likely be happy to help with. So those are Frank's ways of breaking it down. The key question is, which of those would be enough to reassure Europe, and which, if any, would Russia be willing to agree to at this stage? So the fever pitch intensity of the last few days has subsided somewhat, but it is worth saying that diplomatic efforts are still ongoing after all this. Starmer co-chaired a coalition of the willing meeting this morning to update allies on the outcome of the talks. Until we get confirmation of that meeting between Putin and Zelensky, all bets are off, frankly. Many still argue Putin is unlikely to agree to it for some of the reasons we've already discussed. One last thought before I go to Dom. In yesterday's episode, I quoted those who argued yesterday would be the moment of crunch decision for European leaders, whether to support Ukraine or whether to align more with the US, despite it potentially pushing for quite major territorial concessions to the Russians, including swathes of land they do not control. Once again, that moment of decision has been dodged. The key question for me is why? Is it because they have no choice, their dependency on the US is too great, and European leaders dare not upset Trump? Or is it because they have a strategy? They still think the Russians can be shown to be the main barrier to peace, and Trump can still be run round to their cause? Or is there no such strategy, just a desperate hope that by never having to make the moment of decision, they can one day avoid it, as circumstances will simply change? I'd argue a strategy without intention is not a strategy. So what is the strategy now? We just don't know. But we should seriously hope that there is one, because you can bet your bottom ruble that Moscow does. But that's where we are since those extraordinary meetings yesterday. Over to Dom now. Dom, where do you want to start in the military realm?
Well, thanks, Francis, and hello, James. So let's go straight down to the ground in the Donbass. Little movement on the ground actually across the whole front yesterday, but let's focus on the Donbass, and in particular the area in the vicinity of Dobrapia. That's that extension north of Pokrovsk that Russia achieved a couple of weeks ago. So that advance seems to have been contained by Ukrainian forces and is slowly being deleted, although it is very slow. It's not moving, but it is being very slowly attrited by the Ukrainian counterattacking forces. Ukrainian Dnipro Group of Forces spokesperson Colonel Viktor Treybov said yesterday that Ukrainian forces had collapsed the Russian salient near Dobrapia by cutting off Russian infiltration elements from their main forces. Now, I think that's too positive an assessment of what's going on. I think there are elements of Russian troops still in the area, albeit largely cut off from each other. But as I've said before, in military terminology, there's a huge difference between defeat and destroy. If you destroy something, you've killed every single thing there, every person, every tank, every artillery piece. If you've defeated it, you've just worn it down to the extent that it can no longer carry out its primary function. So let's say, I don't know the numbers, but let's say Russia has pushed 400 people up into these two salients. If you've worn them down so that there's only 100 left, well, they are defeated because they can't carry on, like I say, in their main role. But you've still got 100 heavily armed Russians running around, so they've been no way destroyed. I don't think Mr. Treybov is actually correct there. I don't think he could say that it's been collapsed because they are physically still there from what we can see from geolocated footage. Anyway, we will obviously continue to follow that one closely. Elsewhere, and slightly down to the southwest, striking images you'll find on the news channels and social media from Russian-occupied Zaporizhia after a Ukrainian attack on a Russian logistic train carrying fuel near Ostrokivka. There are dozens of drones that are said to have attacked, causing a huge fire when about 10 of these logistic rail fuel wagons exploded. For all the lack of movement I talked about, Russia attacked in force from the air yesterday. Overnight, Russia launched 270 Shahed-type drones, 5 Iskander-M ballistic missiles and 5 Kh-101 cruise missiles at Ukraine. Ukraine's air defense shot down 230 of the drones, 2 of the ballistic missiles and 4 of the cruise missiles, resulted in 16 civilians killed and around 100 others injured. That's in the last 24 hours. So whilst the talks were going on in Washington and overnight last night. Yesterday, worth noting, Russian casualty figures as put out by Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, which, as I keep saying, are taken to be accurate enough for reporting within the usual caveats that it's always very confusing counting figures like this. However, they say that yesterday the Russian casualty figure was 890. Casualties, don't forget, being dead, wounded, missing and taken prisoner, although in this context it's largely dead and wounded. But 890 is very much lower than in recent years, and the number continues to fall recently. Freelancer Tim White, he's been doing some stats crunching. He says July is the lowest daily average for 15 months, and the daily mean for August is almost 100 lower than July. Now, I've been trying to think about this. Well, I have been thinking about this. I've been trying to work out what's going on here. 890 is still a very large number, but down from the well over 1,000 we've seen and up in the sort of 2,000 last autumn. I mean, I don't think it means that Russia is getting better, as in they are better concealing their troops, because they're not making a breakthrough. They are advancing in the small areas where we report, but they are not making any great breakthroughs. Last week's effort north of Cross, I think, is a bit of an outlier. So generally, they're not getting better at their job. Are they conducting fewer attacks? Yeah, possibly. Again, I don't think so from the stats that we're seeing. They are very, very concentrated in the Donbass. So maybe they're all sort of bunching out. I'm not entirely sure what's going on. Be interested in your thoughts. What do you think is accounting for the markedly lower daily casualty rate from Russia, whilst not hugely increasing, or to be fair, decreasing the advances they're making on the front line? So, interested in your thoughts, folks. A couple others from me. The bodies of 1,000 Ukrainians have been returned from Russia as part of repatriation efforts. This comes from Ukraine's coordination headquarters for the treatment of prisoners of war this morning. And just finally, Hungary's Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó, he said Russian crude oil flows to Hungary and Slovakia via the Druzhba pipeline were halted entirely yesterday because of a Ukrainian attack on a portion of that oil network. Now, the head of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces said drones of the 14th Regiment of the Unmanned Systems Unit attacked the Nicholls oil pumping station in Tambov region, which halted the whole Druzhba oil pipeline. That's about 400 kilometers northeast of Ukraine. Now, some folk might question the wisdom of Ukraine striking, albeit indirectly, NATO members when talking up the idea of alliance unity and all these NATO-style security or Article 5 security guarantees that's doing the rounds after yesterday. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha didn't confirm the strike, but wrote on X that Hungary, quote, can now send complaints and threats to Moscow, not Kyiv. Pretty punchy. Hungary imports most of its crude oil still through the Druzhba pipeline, which comes through Belarus and Ukraine. Reuters says that last year, Russia supplied about 95,000 barrels of oil per day to Hungary through the route. Andrei Sybiha continued in his statement. He said, it is Russia, not Ukraine, who began this war and who refuses to end it. Hungary has been told for years that Moscow is an unreliable partner. Despite this, Hungary has made every effort to maintain its reliance on Russia. So interesting, that attack has, depending on your view of Ukraine and Slovakia, how good alliance members are. So is there going to be any blowback here for Ukraine's strike on that pipeline? Anyway, continuing that theme and continuing the recent campaign of Ukraine's long-range strikes against Russia and the energy infrastructure there, Ukrainian drones struck another oil refinery in Volgograd Oblast last night. This comes from Russian Regional Governor Andrei Bosharov. The refinery, which is the oil company Lukoil's second largest refinery in Russia, said to be a major producer of petrol products in Russia's southern federal district. Local residents told the pro-government media outlet Shut that they'd heard between 4 and 10 explosions with lots of drones flying at low altitude and bright flashes overnight. For their part, Russia's MOD said 13 Ukrainian drones were shot down over the region. They didn't say whether any got through, or they gave no account for why the Lukoil's second largest oil plant might have suddenly gone up in smoke. And that's us up to date on the military side, Francis.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for that. Let's bring in James Kilner now, our former Telegraph Russia correspondent and somebody who's been monitoring the events the last few days very, very closely, including reading the Russian media. James, welcome back. Always a pleasure to have you. Can we start with the talk about this bilateral and trilateral meeting? Because, of course, it would be, as we've talked about on the podcast, a major step if Putin were to meet President Zelensky. What has the reaction been in the Russian media to this proposal put forward yesterday and indeed over Alaska, that this might be something that could happen over the coming weeks?
Hi, Francis. Hi, Dom. Pleasure to be back as usual. So this potential bilateral or trilateral meeting that's been talked up has really received a rather muted response in the Russian media. It's not really been discussed in any great detail. Once again, this generally signifies, as I've explained numerous times on this podcast, the Russian media is an extension of the Kremlin propaganda machine. It has to wait for the Kremlin to organize itself and put out its preferred editorial line before this machine can really get going. So what we're seeing once again, and I was talking about this last week ahead of the Alaska meeting, is the Kremlin still trying to work out how to play it, how to react. Putin has been going about his business as usual today. There's been no official word from him on a bilateral meeting. There has been, though, and it hasn't been particularly picked up very well in the Western media. And if I was reporting to a foreigner, I'd be pushing hard on this story. There was a statement made by Yuri Ushakov. He's one of Putin's top aides. You see him at Putin's meetings, generally lurking in the background. And he put out a statement at 1 a.m. Moscow time, talking about this telephone conversation that Trump had with Putin. He says that it was after the meeting with European leaders and Zelensky. I've seen it reported that it was halfway through or whatever. But anyway, and there's the usual sort of platitudes about what a great job that Trump is doing to end this war, that sort of thing, and how Putin and Trump had a nice conversation. It was all very constructive. And then halfway through, there's a very interesting sort of coded statement from the Kremlin, which seems to back up the concept of a Putin-Zelensky meeting. I'll read you the paragraph in question, Francis. So this is Yushakov, his readout, basically, and he will be giving what is currently the official Kremlin line. So he said, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, during this telephone conversation, expressed support for continued direct negotiations between the delegations of Russia and Ukraine. So that's not particularly new, but that's relatively positive. And then he goes on to say, in this regard, the idea was discussed that it may be necessary to study the possibility of raising the level of representatives of both the Ukrainian and Russian sides. So that seems to suggest to me that the Kremlin is very much opening the door to a Putin-Zelensky meeting. Now, of course, the negotiation delegations that last met between Russia and Ukraine were senior officials, and there is still headroom between those guys. Vladimir Medinsky from Russia, for example, is a former culture minister and a trusted and senior aide to Putin, but there's still some headroom to elevate the seniority of the Russian negotiation team, as there will be in Ukraine. But it also, it does open the possibility, to my mind, that Putin may be getting ready to talk to Zelensky. And this is coded Kremlin acknowledgement, and this is on the cards.
Fascinating. Thanks, James. As you say, very much underreported. Let's go back a little bit more in time then and talk about Alaska, because that was a significant step. It's in many ways what Moscow wanted, to have that symbol of Putin no longer being out in the cold and very much on the world stage again, shaking hands with President Trump. How did that go down in the Russian press?
They lapped it up, Francis. They were very happy about it all. And again, they would have got their line from the Kremlin. So the Kremlin was clearly overjoyed with the way it went. It was a complete masterly performance from Putin. I think we can all agree to that he outplayed Trump on almost every level. The headlines in the Russian media were very much, this is Russia back at the top table. This sets the scene for a new era in bilateral relations with the US. This was a serious global success for Russia, etc. That stomach-churning, hand-clapping moment of Trump clapping Putin down the red carpet, which was a completely remarkable sight, was played very heavily across Russian media. And down to the fact that Putin was able to dodge any ceasefire negotiations, this was considered a success. And then this clever play that Putin made right at the end of the whole thing, when he answered in English, invited Trump to Moscow in English. It's very, very rare for Putin to speak English publicly. So there was a real sense that Putin was on his top game here, and he really dominated that show. The Kremlin also set up very cleverly, and this was a point that was also made quite strongly to the Russian public, that in many ways, although this was an extraordinary meeting, obviously, between Putin and Trump, it was also Putin business as usual. We know that he stopped in Magadan, this city in Far East Russia, on his way over to Alaska, where he met a children's ice hockey team, had a chat with the regional governor, and he toured a fish oil factory as well, and then went and did this meeting with Trump. And then on his way back, while Trump sped off back to Washington, Putin also made time in Alaska to lay a wreath at a memorial for dead Russian pilots, and according to reports, also made time to see a Russian Orthodox priest in Alaska. So the framing in Russia was that Putin had nailed it, and he'd also just gone about his business as usual, and he'd made time for ordinary Russians, and they were at the forefront of his mind throughout this whole extraordinary day.
Interesting. Now, another meeting, or call, should I say, that's taken place this week, which hasn't been as much remarked upon, but involved the American president, was a conversation that he had with Lukashenko of Belarus. Now, we've not covered this on the podcast yet because of everything else that was going on, but James, you've been looking into this for us. What were they talking about?
Right. So again, a slightly underreported story, obviously overshadowed by the Alaska meeting between Putin and Trump. This was on Friday morning, only a few hours before the Putin-Trump Alaska meeting. And it was quite extraordinary. So this was a personal phone call between Trump and Lukashenko, in which Trump basically thanked Lukashenko for releasing 16 political prisoners in July, and said that negotiations open to releasing another 1,300 political prisoners in Belarus. The story of this phone call was initially broken by Belarusian media, but Trump also confirmed this a few hours later on his own social media platform. And he was using incredible language. So put it into the context for your listeners, and I'm sure they know the background more or less anyway, but Lukashenko cracked down on pro-democracy demonstrators after an election in 2020. He's considered the last dictator in Europe. He allowed Belarus to be used as the launch pad for the drive on Kiev in February 2022, the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine. He now hosts Russian nuclear weapons, pointing at Europe, all this sort of thing. And he's been a major confidant and foil for Putin, especially in the early days of the war when Putin didn't have any friends at all. Lukashenko is there. So that's the context. The Europeans are just not talking to this guy. And then you have Trump on his social media platform going, quote, "I had a wonderful talk with the highly respected president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko. I'm looking forward to meeting Lukashenko in the near future." Extraordinary stuff. And then the Belarusian Newswire was saying how Lukashenko had actually invited Trump to Minsk, and that Trump had accepted the invitation. Of course, there's been no official acknowledgement of this. And again, to put it in context, the only time a US president has visited Belarus since the collapse of the Soviet Union was in 1994, Bill Clinton. But as we've seen with so many things on the international scene since Trump has come to power, he has ripped up the playbook. So he sent Keith Kellogg, his personal envoy to Ukraine, to Belarus in June. A senior deputy secretary of state was there a few months earlier. So the US has clearly decided that there's some play to be made in Belarus, and there's influence there which can have a wider effect. And although Lukashenko is no advisor to Putin, he is in the conversation. They do chat, they do have dinner together. So I think this is a clever move by Trump, and we'll see where it leads.
James, can I just jump in for a moment? You're talking about clever moves there. I want to put something to you and seek your opinion on this. The whole thing about the bilat, trilat. So from the meetings yesterday in the White House, the next stage is going to be a meeting apparently between Putin and Zelensky. And then after that, a meeting between Putin, Zelensky and Trump. And we're trying to work out why they were going for it in that order. And in the special podcast that we did late last night, I just kind of wondered if they went for the trilat, first of all, with Trump in attendance. Putin may well turn up, but he would utterly sideline Zelensky. It would all be Putin-Trump. Zelensky could be quite humiliated, etc., etc. And so I wonder if they went for the bilat construct so that there's no way that Putin could avoid Zelensky, and simply by meeting him, it would acknowledge the sovereignty of Ukraine, and that it would be a peer-to-peer, president-to-president meeting. Now, I think that may well be the reason for it, but then the location becomes interesting. And I just wonder, we know that Putin's invited Donald Trump to Moscow for the next meeting. That was the bit he said when I was with them, when I was in Alaska. That was the last thing that Putin said in English at the end of the very short press conference when he invited Donald to Moscow. So I wonder if he would also invite Zelensky to that meeting, because that then invites Zelensky to turn in security grounds, not wanting to fly to Russia, in which case Putin, he's not serious about it. I invited him and he hasn't bothered turning up. But also, then he'd control anything that would happen. We wouldn't see anything from the public point of view. We wouldn't see any behind closed doors. We wouldn't see any meeting between Putin and Zelensky. All we'd be treated to, we'd just be told that the bilat had happened in the morning, and then the trilateral meeting with Trump in the afternoon, and then there'd be lots of pictures of Putin and Trump again, as I set out earlier. That's my kind of cod theory on what's going on here. James, you know the Kremlin better than us. How likely is that? How possible? Is there any way at all that Putin would invite Zelensky to Moscow?
Possibly, Dom. Of course it is possible. Do I see it happening? I mean, that would very much feel to me like absolute submission from Zelensky, going to the court of Putin and bending the knee and signing some sort of document. Sounds like a surrender document. I'm sure Putin and his aides would love that. I just cannot envisage it. Obviously, I could be wrong. And to bring it back to this coded statement from the Kremlin, it sounds to me like they see the next stage as a bilateral meeting between Russia and Ukraine, possibly at presidential level. But they're talking about negotiations. They're not talking about a peace deal at the moment. That's the way I'd frame it for your listeners. For me, we're getting too far ahead of ourselves. I think there's a bit more to go with these negotiations before there's any peace deal done. And from what we know about Trump, it makes sense to me that it'd be a high-level bilateral meeting, possibly between Zelensky and Trump, to my mind at a neutral venue, but of course could well be wrong. I don't have any insight on this. And then that may then set up for the actual peace deal that Trump can be present to preside over. He presided over the Azerbaijani-Armenia peace deal when at the very final moment in Washington a couple of weeks ago. So I think probably that's what he wants to do.
Of course, there's the possibility that they would invite Zelensky to Moscow, knowing that Zelensky would reject going there. And then the pressure, as it were, is on Ukraine again, because Putin can say, well, I've tried to have a meeting with him, but he wouldn't do it. I mean, again, I think this is unlikely, but even so, it's interesting to ponder these possibilities. And I do agree with Dom that it does seem like a potentially smart move to compel the next stage to be between Putin and Zelensky, so that the Russians can't hide the fact that they've been meeting with Zelensky, which they would do if Trump was present. But James, there are a few other subjects that I just wanted us to ask you about. Let's move then away from the diplomatic realm and more into the military in a sense. And there was that overnight strike on Azerbaijan oil and gas infrastructure in Odessa. Why is that important, do you think, given the context of things at the moment?
So this is the second Russian missile strike in about 10 days on oil and gas infrastructure owned by Sokar. Sokar is the Azerbaijani state oil and gas company. So in Odessa, it's kit in Odessa. As I've spoken about at some length on your podcast previously, Francis, we know that Russian-Azerbaijani relations have collapsed this year since the shooting down on Christmas Day of an Azerbaijani airliner by Russian air defense systems around Grozny. And this is sort of completely pushed Azerbaijan into Ukraine's camp, to the extent where about 3 weeks ago now, the Azerbaijani president, who has been chatting with Zelensky on the phone at a semi-regular interval in the last few months, agreed to supply gas to Ukraine. This was a total affront to the Kremlin, and they have now struck Azerbaijan's energy infrastructure owned by Sokar in Odessa twice in the last 10 days, as I was saying. After the first attack, Azerbaijani President Aliyev went on the record and said, or his officials or the government went on the record saying that they were now considering supplying arms to Ukraine, which is an incredible shift in alliance from Azerbaijan. Since then, we've had Russian propagandists in the Russian media come out and say, after we dealt with Ukraine, we should then invade Azerbaijan sort of thing. So it's going too far to say this is going to spread the war, certainly at this stage, but it just sort of escalates everything in the region. So I do think this is a story to watch. Azerbaijan is tiptoeing dangerously into this conflict, having been completely neutral before, and it certainly plays into Ukraine and the West's hands, but is also a danger point for the South Caucasus region.
Now, we've been talking about the Ukrainian drone attacks for a long time, and I wonder if you could just comment really on the wider impact that we're seeing, whether it be economically, whether it be politically, as a consequence of these steep strikes, whether it be on Russia or whether it be choreographed to be involved in some of the countries that we've been talking about earlier today.
Right. So in the Russian media today, they're talking about this large refinery in the Samara region, that's south-central Russia, borders Kazakhstan. This refinery has been taken offline for at least a month after a Ukrainian drone attack, I think on Friday evening. Now, analysts say that with this oil refinery going offline, Russia's had 14% of its oil refining capacity taken out of action this year by Ukrainian drones. This is a very successful strategy by Ukraine to undermine Russian industry, etc. The impact on the consumer and on industry is that, according to reports, is that petrol prices have gone up across Russia, and particularly steeply in the regions where these refineries are based, by up to 40%, between 20 and 40%, which obviously has a huge knock-on impact. The economy, as I keep saying, Francis, is one of the Achilles heels of the Kremlin. Interest rates are sky high. It's funded by war procurement. There's not enough people to work in the system anymore. Inflation is too high. There was a story today in the Russian media saying that the owner of Lada, Russia's biggest car manufacturer, is looking for a state bailout. There's constant stories about coal mines having to put people on part-time because the coal mine industry is collapsing, all this sort of stuff. And these Ukrainian drone strikes are just pushing that button even more. They're sort of undermining the economic capacity of Russia as it teeters anyway. And come back to this story in the Telegraph a week or so ago, saying that these internet shutdowns that has been rolling out across Russian regions have been used to crush free speech. I really think it's an attempt by the Kremlin to try and stop these drone strikes, which are causing so much pain. There's loads of stories across the Russian media almost daily talking about these internet shutdowns from about midnight to 6 in the morning typically, and how they affect bars and nightclubs, food couriers, people on shift work, can't do their work properly, taxis, haulage companies, all this sort of thing. So as well as the headline tax on oil refineries, you've got a huge amount of Russia's economy, which is being impacted by these drone strikes and the internet cutoff. And it just hits people's ability to operate, hits people's ability to work, and undermines morale. It's been an incredibly effective strategy by Ukraine. It does not dominate the Russian media, but it's been talked about the whole time. And when the Kremlin comes to thinking about whether it can pursue its war in Ukraine indefinitely or for a lot longer, this sort of thing will be niggling along in the background, I think.
Fascinating. Lastly, James, a story that, again, we talk about on the podcast a lot, and that's Russian military recruitment. Where are we in terms of that at the moment? There have been reports over the last few months that there have been some lower numbers in terms of mobilisation. What are you seeing?
Again, Francis, really interesting stories popped up here that I'm sure your listeners will be interested in. We've seen a very sharp drop-off in Russian military recruitment in the second quarter of the year. This is official data being published by some Russian opposition media, say that 38,000 men signed up for the Russian army in Q2 of 2025, compared to 93,000 in the same period last year. So, I mean, that's a huge drop. That's a 60% drop, more or less. It's not entirely clear why this has happened. We do know, Francis, that there has been a sharp cut in the size of the signing on bonuses that regions have been offering men to sign up for the military. These signing on bonuses were worth several years' salary of a normal Russian and had been identified as a major drive for Russia's huge recruitment numbers. And again, it comes back to the economic conditions. These bonuses being cut may literally just undermine the flow of men into the Russian army. Of course, there could be an enormous amount of fatigue as well. And as you know, I was there in October. Russians are very aware of what's happening on the front line. They're very aware of the high counselling numbers. If you take out these huge signing on bonuses and general war fatigue, you would expect a drop in recruitment. This is a very significant job.
Let's go to our final thoughts then. Dom, let's start with you.
Thanks, Francis. Well, the last 36, 48, 72 hours, it's been a full-on diet of red meat. So I'd just like to break it up a little bit by introducing a bit of pink salmon. I just want to say thank you to my new pals, Alison and Kevin, who very delightfully got in touch with me whilst I was in Anchorage and said before my horrific flight home, did I want to go around for a home-cooked salmon meal on Saturday night, which I absolutely did. It was wonderful and set me up nicely for what awaited me on Alaska Airlines and British Airways. So Alison and Kevin, thank you so much for your hospitality. It was a lovely tonic at the end of a pretty hectic few days. So thank you very much, and I look forward to meeting you again.
Thanks very much to Alison and Kevin. James, you as our guest have the final thoughts today. Where do you want to leave listeners?
Sounds like an interesting trip, Dom, witnessing history firsthand. Fantastic. Well, I really want to see this statement analysed and written about properly and find out what other people think about it. It does seem to me that Kremlin is signifying definitely a shift. It's sort of almost a nod that this is going to happen. So that's what I'll be looking out for. And I would like to leave your listeners with another piece of economic data. I know it can seem a bit dry, but I think it is really important. The IMF said beginning of the week that for the first time ever, Kazakhstan's GDP per capita is now outstripped Russia's. So the IMF has been downgrading Russian growth, GDP propelment. It says that the war-fueled growth for the last couple of years has come to an end and its economy is stagnating and will sort of slip behind emerging markets. This seems to be proof. Kazakhstan's economy, by comparison, has been booming, partly because of the grey import-export products they're bringing in for Russia, etc. But the IMF says for the first time that Kazakhstan's GDP per capita is now higher than Russia's, measuring $14,770 per person rather than compared to Russia's $14,260. This is the first time that a former Soviet country in Central Asia or the South Caucasus is now considered richer per capita than Russia.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, We're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.